28. This one was really short. It takes place on the morning after Flora refused Edward's offer for marriage. He had a few hours sleep and he was woken by David Gallatley. That's the impaired man from Bradwardine Manor who wore the jester costume. Davy came in singing and dancing, which is his way, and he was singing a Jacobite song, and he managed to get a lot of the people in the castle grounds singing along with him. Mid-song, he spotted Edward and gave him a letter. Edward then went away to read the letter. It was from Rose. Rose told him that she was now alone at Bradwardine Manor. Soldiers had come to arrest a lot of the gentlemen who they thought were Jacobites. Her father was one of them. He and about 40 of his countrymen, including Bally, had taken off into the hills. They had headed north on horseback to avoid arrest. I presume he thought Rose would be safe staying behind. It seems a little risky to me. But anyway, she was there and the soldiers arrived. They searched Bradwardine Manor. They took whatever weaponry they could find there and they arrested Edward's servant, who had been there that whole time, and took both of his horses. Rose said in the letter that they had asked after him and wanted to know exactly where he was. I gather she didn't tell them. But she sent this letter with Davy so that Edward would know what was going on and to advise him to leave Scotland and return to England, where she presumed he would be safe because he had told her a lot about England's justice and how fair it all was. On receiving that letter, Edward decided that it was probably a good idea, since that was exactly what Flora had said yesterday. But instead of going back home to England, he plans to go to Edinburgh to speak to somebody in charge of the military to let them know that he's actually innocent. The way he's thinking really is that crack-brained. He doesn't seem to have any idea of what he might be getting into. He just thinks that if he tells them he's innocent, they're going to believe him. So he went to Fergus to let him know that he's leaving. Fergus said, if you go to Edinburgh, they're going to throw you in the dungeon and then we're going to have to rescue you at some point. Edward says, no, that won't happen. I really am innocent. They will understand. Fergus tries a little bit longer to convince him to stay, to take up the tartan in the cause of Charles Stuart, but Edward still feels the best thing for him to do is to go to Edinburgh, explain the misunderstanding, and then go home. So Fergus agrees and says, well, I won't need a horse, you can have mine. His horse has a name. His horse is Brown Dermot, and he says, you can have Brown Dermot. He also says, I will ride beside you as far as the nearest town on Flora's pony and say goodbye to you there. The other thing he says is, it's a bit hard for Rose to be stuck there on her own. The soldiers have stayed in Bradwardine Manor. A couple of them have arrested Edward's servant and taken the servant and horses away, but they seem to be setting up as a small garrison there. Fergus thinks this isn't right. Rose shouldn't be putting up with this. He would like to have Rose at Glennaquoich. He says this while they are waiting for Flora to come out. He's sent Kathleen to get Flora to come and say goodbye to them before Edward leaves, and Edward is really focused on that. He's sort of watching the door to see Flora. So he's not really listening to what Fergus is saying. But Fergus says, but Rose Bradwardine, her situation must be thought of. I wish she were here. And why should she not? There are but 4 redcoats at Tully Veolan, and their muskets would be very useful to us. Edward's kind of missed all this, and he kind of isn't at all concerned. He's just thinking about Flora because she's about to appear. But it does sound like Fergus is going to go and rescue Rose, which is kind of nice. Maybe he does actually like her. Maybe it's not just that he wants Bradwardine Manor. This chapter closes with Kathleen coming back into the room and saying that Flora has declined to come and say goodbye in person, but she sends her best wishes. Chapter 29. It's hot, it's humid, it's late, I'm tired, but I've read another chapter. This chapter didn't make much sense to me. I mean, it did, but I struggled with it. It could just be because it's late and I'm tired and it's hot and humid. really, really, really humid. That's not our normal climate here, but there are floods everywhere in Australia at the moment, and I think moisture just seems to be coming this way too. Anyway, this chapter, Fergus had this servant. His name is Caleb Begg. He's actually been in the story for several chapters, and I hadn't mentioned him because there are a lot of mentions of minor characters, and I've just been trying to figure out who is a major character and who isn't. But it turns out I made a mistake with Caleb because here he is, still in the story. So in this chapter, Edward rode out of Glenaquoich with Fergus as far as a place called Ballybro, which I think is not terribly far from Glenaquoich, at which point Fergus left him and he carried on with Caleb Begg, who is one of Fergus's main Highlander guys. Caleb Begg is now dressed as a Lowlands groom. So he's a Scottish person, definitely, but not a Highlander. He's dressed as a Lowlands groom. And I'm guessing he's on foot. I'm not sure. I know Edward is riding, but I think that Caleb may be on foot. Anyway, they travel through the day. I'm not sure for how long, a couple of hours maybe longer. And they come to the village of, and it's a long dash. That is frustrating me a bit. I know that means it's a real place. But, you know, he could at least put a first letter. I don't know what to call it when it's just a long dash. They've come to the village of Long Dash. And when they get there, there's nobody to be seen until a whole bunch of old women, that's what Scott says, pours out of a building. And Edward looks at them and says, "Is it Sunday?" And Caleb says, "I don't know." And some heap of Scottish stuff. It's sort of Scottish English stuff written phonetically, which Scott seems to be just starting to do. But I think the gist of it is that we don't really have days up in Glenaquoich, so you wouldn't know if it's Sunday or not. You wouldn't know what day it is. Something else he says here is that Edward should not mention Vityanvor in this village because they're mostly Whigs, mostly supporters of the king. Having settled that, they go into the village and they go to an inn. The person they meet at the inn is described in great detail. He seems like a really strange character. He is tall, he is wearing a great coat, even though the weather doesn't really require it. He seems to have a solid body and very thin legs. He is described in great detail. He kind of seems like the sort of character you find in American westerns. So he met them, and he wasn't all that pleased to see them coming because it is the Sabbath and people should not be travelling on the Sabbath. He is the proprietor of a public house called the Golden Candlestick. Or it might be the seven-branched golden candlestick because Scott uses both. And I'm not sure which is the name of the place and which is just referring to the sign. The sign of the seven-branched golden candlestick was graced with a short Hebrew motto. And the proprietor, who is the man with the great coat, is described as a tall, thin, puritanical figure who seemed to debate with himself whether he ought to give shelter to those who travelled on such a day, it being Sunday, not a day that you should be travelling. But then he decided he can probably charge them double because they're travelling on the Sunday, so he may as well serve them. We don't know this for sure because we're kind of in Edward's head, but Scott gives us to understand as much. Edward doesn't actually intend to stay at this public house. He just wants a horse and a guide to go to Edinburgh. So he asks for that. And this fellow, and I don't remember his name, this fellow is Mr. Ebenezer Crookshanks. Mr. Ebenezer Crookshanks says, well, that can't be done today. It's Sunday. But before he says that, he sort of asks him 20 questions. Who are you? Where have you come from? Why do you want to go to Edinburgh? All sorts of stuff like that. And Edward won't answer. Edward feels that it's none of his business. Well, Edward tells him as such. And then when Mr. Crookshanks persists, Edward, who never did have much presence with people, had actually picked up a bit of it during his time with the military, and he manages to sound quite authoritative and says, "I came here for my own accommodation and not to answer impertinent questions. Either say you can or cannot get me what I want. I shall pursue my course in either case." Makes him sound very upper-class British there. And that isn't a way he used to act. He is sort of growing up a bit here, I think. Mr. Crookshanks realises he's not going to get an answer. He leaves the room to organise some food, and he goes outside to the courtyard where Caleb Beg is brushing the horses and tries to get answers from him. Edward is sitting inside and he can hear all this going on, so he can hear that Caleb hasn't really told. Caleb lies through his teeth. Caleb says they have come from, where does he say? From Aberdeen, and that they haven't been near the Highlands because Ebenezer Crookshanks is suspecting they've come from the Highlands. Caleb says, "No, came from Aberdeen and we're going to Edinburgh." More to the point, his master is going to Edinburgh and he may not be going any further. Ebenezer Crookshanks says, "And what kind of a gentleman is he?" And Caleb said, "I believe he is one of King George's state officers," which is kind of what he was until recently. After this, a little bit later on, Caleb comes to Edward when they're alone and says, "I don't really trust this man. I don't think you should trust him either. If you want me to kill him, I will." He says it a little bit less directly, but, that's the gist of it. Edward's a bit surprised by this because Callum's not a very old lad. He looks at him and wonders that he can just talk about murder so easily and says, "Would you really kill him?" And Callum says, "Of course." And Edward says, "I don't think that'll be necessary." It seems like Callum isn't going any further, so Edward gives him a golden guinea, which I guess is paying him for his trouble, says, "Take this, go drink Vidjan Vor's health." Callum is kind of impressed by this. I feel like Edward shouldn't have mentioned Vidjan Vor's name here. Callum told him not to, and there's no knowing who is listening. But anyway, this is their parting, and on their parting, Callum gives Edward a letter that Fergus gave him to pass on at the time that they separated. Callum gives him this letter now and goes. Edward reads the letter. It is from Fergus, and it's kind of a clever letter. The letter turned chiefly upon some trifling commissions which Waverley had promised to execute for him in England. It was only towards the conclusion that Edward found these words: "I owe Flora a grudge for refusing us her company yesterday, and as I am giving you the trouble of reading these lines, in order to keep in your memory your promise to procure me the fishing tackle and crossbow from London, I will enclose her verses on the grave of Wogan." Maybe I should have mentioned that before. That came up in a previous chapter. Wogan was a hero of the time of Charles II that Flora was very fond of. He had started off on the side of a usurper king of that era and had turned to the rightful king and undertaken wonderful service for him and died a hero. He is one of Flora's main heroes. She's very impressed by this man, and she wrote some verses about him. So Vidjan Vor has included these verses and said, "I believe Flora is more in love with this hero Wogan than with anybody alive now, and the person she chooses will probably be the person most like him," which is really sneaky, because he obviously knows that Edward is going to want to do what this man's done, if that is going to win him Flora. He also says, "Make friends as many and as fast as you can. There will speedily be unexpected guests on the coast of Suffolk. All my news from France has deceived me." So that's a bit of forewarning of coming events too. Having read these lines of poetry that Flora wrote, Edward goes outside. Mr. Crookshanks has found a horse, but he is determined to accompany them himself. He's going to go as far as Perth with them. The other horse turns up. They've got Edward's portmanteau on it. I didn't realise he had a portmanteau. I guess he's had it this whole time. Mr. Crookshanks goes over to like a mounting post and plants himself on his horse on top of the portmanteau. He mounts very stiffly and very uncomfortably, and he looks so comical that Edward can't help laughing. Crookshanks realises that Edward is laughing at him, and my battery died. Ebenezer Crookshanks saw that Edward was laughing at him, and he promised himself vengeance. the chapter ends with them riding out of the village. Not really much I want to say about this, but I have had a few thoughts about the lack of attention paid to the young men from Waverley Honour who joined the regiment, basically because Edward was joining up and Sir Everard felt that some of the youngsters should go with him. And now they're stuck. Now Edward's left and they're still in the regiment and they can't just resign their commission like he can. They're stuck there. It might be that Sir Everard can write a letter and get them removed, but will he? I mean, nobody's thinking about that. Edward's not thinking about them. Even Scott, the author, isn't mentioning them. So I do wonder just what's going to come of those men, if they're even going to feature in this story again. The other thing is the servant. Edward's servant who was arrested at Bradwardine Manor. Edward is very concerned about asserting his own innocence, going and correcting this error so that he's not arrested. He doesn't seem to be thinking about the plight of that servant. I mean, the guy did nothing wrong. He was doing his job, and now he's been arrested. It might be that part of Edward asserting his innocence is in order to get this servant freed. I hope it is. But he just doesn't seem to be worrying about him at all and wondering how he's going. That might be because this is Edward we're talking about, and Edward is just very bad at understanding the world. So it might be that he doesn't really have any concept of what conditions that servant might be being held in. And I guess it's a hard call for Scott as the author to mention him, but Scott is just able to mention whatever he wants. He basically said that in that other chapter when he was talking about the length, how he can put in what he wants. And he also hasn't mentioned this servant. So maybe that's going to be a plot point. Maybe he's going to get to Edinburgh. Maybe he's going to petition for the release of that servant. But me, in the present day, reading this book is just thinking that poor man. And what kind of society is this where somebody can be arrested just because they are the servant of somebody who is suspected of wrongdoing, and a servant, moreover, who was left behind, who was clearly not with Edward when he did the things that they're imagining he's done. I did want to mention those points before we go on. Now we are up to chapter 30. Chapter 30. Crookshanks and Edward have only been riding a few hours when Crookshanks' horse loses a shoe, and he suggests that Edward needs to pay for new shoes because he has hired the horse basically for this journey to carry his portmanteau. So they go to the next town, which is right there, which is called Canvrecken. Crookshanks says that he's going to have trouble finding a smithy working because it's a Sunday, but when they go in, the smithy is busy working. There's stuff going down, there are people everywhere. The smithy is repairing swords and all kinds of weaponry, and it turns out some rumour has come down that the Highland lords are on the move with their armies, and they're going to come into the lowlands very soon. So everybody is in danger, so they're getting their weapons ready so that they can defend themselves. Now, the smithy's name is John Muckleroth, and he has a wife who is a Jacobite. I'm kind of confused about this scene. It might be another of Scott's comedic scenes. The smith is busy working, and he's working very hard, and he's hot, and he's just doing lots of stuff. His wife is around the age of 40 and is not described very flatteringly. She seems to be a large woman. Scott says it looks as if she threw on her clothes with a pitchfork. She's carrying a 2-year-old child. She's singing to the 2-year-old child, and the 2-year-old child is crying and seems to be not enjoying this at all, but she's not noticing. I don't know if Scott is kind of telling us that she's a drinking woman and that she's rather drunk at the moment, because they never did in these days. They never actually came out and said that. If someone was drinking, occasionally someone will make a comment that they've had a lot to drink or whatever, but drunkenness, they never, it's like they didn't have a word for drunk. They never seem to notice in these days. Even early on when they had that massive drinking session with the Baron of Bradwardine at Tully Veolan, they never really actually used the word drunk. It was kind of only when he talked the next day about it. They did say that Alexander and Edward had helped him back, but yeah, they never used the word drunk. It just didn't come up. I'm not sure. I'm just wondering if that's it, if this is a woman who's had a bit to drink. Anyway, she is singing Jacobite songs, and this is a village that's clearly a Whig village and definitely on the side of King George II. They're not best pleased with her, but she's not noticing. She is just carrying on singing her songs and saying, when the Highlanders come down, they're going to beat you, you don't have a chance, you're not real men, that sort of thing. And they're just kind of sort of drowning her out. But then she notices Edward, and she says to her husband, who is trying to shut her up, she says, why don't you stop fixing all these swords and doing this silly stuff and earn some money at last? So I gather that he is not getting paid for this work. This is just for the town's defence, and he is just having to do this. But Edward is a paid job. So Edward is there with his horse, and she says, come on, serve the fair young gentleman. Look at him. He's come from the Highlands. He's clearly an important person. He's better than the lot of you. And that has everybody looking very suspiciously at Edward. And people are sort of wondering who he is. And there's a few people that even think he might be Bonnie Prince Charlie himself. They don't know. He's clearly a gentleman. And Edward doesn't say anything. He sort of is a bit alarmed by this, but he just says, can you shoe my horse? I'll be on my way. It sort of all erupts. They're all looking at him suspiciously now and saying, are you a Jacobite? We don't want you here. We don't want to serve you. So Edward thinks, I'll just get out of here. This is too dangerous. And he looks around for his horse, and Crookshanks is sort of somewhere over the other side of the square with Edward's horse and his own. Edward calls out and says, bring the horse to me. And Crookshanks says, no, if you're a Jacobite, if you're from the Highlands, I don't want to bother you. I'm not bringing them to you. And at that, the smithy, who is still really mad at his wife, she says something that goads him to anger, and he picks up this bar as if he's going to hit her with it, and people hold him back. But instead, he goes to attack Edward, who takes out his pistol and shoots the smithy, who falls to the ground. And at this point, Scott says that, a man in this position, if he keeps his head, he's actually in a good position. Even though he can only shoot one person, nobody knows which person that is, and nobody wants to be that person. But Edward doesn't keep his head, and he gets rushed from behind, and they capture him and disarm him. It turns out the smithy is not dead. In fact, he's just grazed. He gets to his feet, and he says, arrest him, we'll take him to the magistrate. So at the end of this chapter, they take Edward to the nearest big house. Now, this is something that happened, not only in this time period, but in the time that Scott was writing in 1815, it was still the case. It was almost not the case because they were starting to set up the police force. That was being discussed and debated in around 1815. But back now, any time up to then, police work was done by the magistrates, and all of the squires and gentlefolk were magistrates. So they laid down the law in their own constituent, which was sort of their own region, which is why the Baron of Bradwardine could put that woman in the stocks that got mentioned early on. He is the magistrate for Tully Veolan. So this town, Canvrecken, also has a magistrate who is, we haven't met him yet, but he's got the big house. The big house is the mansion called Canvrecken, and that is where Edward has just been taken. And that's what happens at the end of this chapter. I don't know what to say about this chapter either. There was a lot of action, and Scott didn't go overboard. Definitely the storycraft has improved. He's onto something now. I'm quite sure he wrote this later on. He's not interrupting his big moments with random description like he was earlier. He's not labouring the point. You do get a sense in those early chapters that he did not have confidence in his ability to communicate the setting and the events, and so he just laboured them too much, whereas now he's using the words he needs to use, and he's moving it forward. So this scene with Edward in the middle of this rabble and getting more nervous, and the smithy being annoyed at his wife and the wife goading them, and it all actually flowed very nicely. And that's probably all I need to say. I won't labour the point either. We'll just move on to the next chapters.